Hi, this is Matt Baker, and today I'm going to talk about DNA tests. I know that a lot of people who watch this channel are interested in genealogy and in building their own family trees. Well, nowadays, one of the things that can help you build your family tree is doing a DNA test. But there are a lot of different DNA tests out there, so you might be wondering, which one should I take? That's where this video might help. You see, I took 5 different DNA tests, and in this video, I'm going to compare them and show you what the results look like for each one. And full disclosure, I did receive some of these kits free of charge for review purposes, but I'm going to keep an open mind and let you know what I think of each one. With that said, let's begin. The 5 kits I'm going to review are Circle DNA, Family Tree DNA, Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and MyHeritage. And I'm going to talk about them in order of price, from the most expensive to the least expensive. So up first is Circle DNA. Their basic service costs $189. Note that I'll be using US dollars throughout. Their premium service costs $629. So yeah, that's pretty expensive. But keep in mind that you get what you pay for. Circle DNA is primarily focused on health-related information, and in that regard, it definitely gives you the most detailed health information of any DNA kit that I've tried. In fact, they market themselves as the world's most comprehensive DNA test. Also, keep in mind that all of these companies tend to offer discounts around holidays, such as Mother's Day, Christmas, etc. So you can usually get 30 to 40% off if you time things right. In fact, Circle DNA has offered a special deal for everyone watching this video. If you use the link in the description along with the discount code MATTB33, you will instantly get 33% off any of their tests. Now, when it comes to DNA tests, there are generally 2 methods of collection. Some kits give you a swab that you simply rub against the inside of your cheek and then place in a vial of liquid, whereas other kits require you to spit a bunch of times into a vial, which generally takes a little longer and is a little bit more difficult. In both cases, the most important thing is to not eat or drink or even brush your teeth for at least 30 minutes before you take the test. So for each test, I'll let you know which method they use. In the case of Circle DNA, they use the swab method. The process for any of these tests is pretty much the same after that. The first thing you have to do is register the sample using the number on the vial. The instructions will be sent with the kit. This is extremely important because if you skip this step, the company won't know which sample is yours. You then place the vial into a special bag that they provide. Note that these usually include a special piece of paper that you must not remove. This is because that paper somehow helps to keep the sample fresh. And then you place the bag in the box. Again, they usually provide that and mail it back to the company. Next and finally comes the most difficult part of all, the waiting. No matter which company you use, you will have to wait several weeks, usually around a month, for them to receive your sample, analyze it, and send you an email with a link to the results. Okay, let's now take a look at the results that Circle DNA sent me. I took the premium version, so there's a lot to go through. First of all, the really serious stuff. Circle DNA checked my health risk for 36 hereditary cancers, as well as 79 other conditions. This is just a partial report. Fortunately, I was not at an elevated risk for any of the cancers. However, I did learn that I am at a higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes. Now, I already knew that diabetes runs in my family, so this wasn't really much of a surprise. However, it reminded me that I should probably cut back on the sweets. Interestingly, it did not predict that I was at higher risk for ulcerative colitis, a disease that I did in fact get in my 20s, which just goes to show that genetics is not destiny. Most health conditions are a result of our genes, our environment, and our life choices. So, while discovering more about our genes can help us to some degree, a DNA test isn't a replacement for common sense and doing our best to stay as healthy as possible. Circle DNA also tested to see whether or not I was a carrier for 163, mostly rare, hereditary conditions. These are often single genes that may end up causing disease in oneself or one's children. From this report, I learned that I am a carrier for a gene that can be particularly dangerous for those who are heavy smokers. Fortunately, I've never been a smoker, nor have either of my kids, but it is something I do plan to mention to my doctor, just in case. Another neat report that Circle DNA gives relates to drug response. It covers 103 FDA-approved drugs and tells you which ones may not work as well on you personally when taken at the usual doses. The rest of the things tested fall into what I would call the fun category. For example, I learned that I might have a higher than usual sensitivity to taste. Interesting. That I'm a morning person. True. That I could use more vitamin D. Did not know that. That I have a low wrinkle formation. Didn't know that either. That I'm an introvert. I did know that. That I might be extra sensitive to pesticides. That I don't sneeze when I look at the sun. Can't say I ever tried that. That I don't tend towards addiction. That I have blue eyes. That I'm not likely to be super muscular. Sad, but true. That I'm not gifted at music. Yeah, my wife can confirm that one. And my favorite of all, that I'm really smart. So true, so true. Anyway, these are just a sampling of the 100 plus fun things that the test told me. Finally, there was an ancestry report, but it was very basic and from what I can see, not very accurate. Like I said, Circle DNA is primarily focused on health, not genealogy. Okay, however, the rest of the kits we're going to look at are primarily focused on genealogy. And next up is family tree DNA. They too use the swab method. At first glance, their price, at $80 for a basic test, seems quite cheap, but that's because they separate out their more detailed reports, which cost extra. And it's at this point that I should probably explain some important terms. Autosomal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and Y chromosome DNA. Basically, autosomal DNA is the kind of DNA that you're most likely familiar with. It's the DNA that is approximately 50% from your mother and 50% from your father. So, testing your autosomal DNA gives you information about your entire family tree as a whole. So, for example, unless you're a Habsburg, you probably have 16 great-grandparents, each of which contributed, on average, about 6% of your DNA. Now, the exact amount can actually be quite different, which is why a DNA test comes in handy. For many people, like myself, their ancestors came from a variety of different places. So an autosomal test can give you an approximate breakdown of where those ancestors came from. So here's what my ancestry report from Family Tree DNA looks like. You can see that it is more detailed than the one from Circle DNA. And once again, the results seem a bit off. Way more Eastern European than I would expect, which just goes to show that these composition estimates are just that. They are estimates, and each company comes up with their estimates in slightly different ways. Now, I want to point out the other thing that an autosomal test can do, which Family Tree DNA provides, but Circle DNA does not. And that is to provide you with relative matches. So this report shows you other people that have taken the same test who share a high percentage of the same DNA as you, and it ranks them according to the closeness of the relationship. For those who were adopted or know very little about their family tree, this is where things get interesting because you can then reach out to each person and try to figure out how exactly you are related. Note, if you take a DNA test, you are not automatically given a family tree. You are simply given a list of relatives, and from there, you have to do the research and start building one of your own. Let me now explain the other two types of DNA, starting with mitochondrial DNA. Inside every cell in your body are cell parts called mitochondria. And those mitochondria have DNA that is totally different from your main DNA, which is stored in the nucleus. It's different because 100% of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. In other words, your mitochondria is the same as your mother's mitochondria, which is the same as her mother's mitochondria, etc., etc. So a mitochondrial DNA test can tell you information about only a very small section of your family tree, your matrilineal line. But unlike an autosomal test, it can tell you information that goes back much farther in history, like tens of thousands of years far. This is because, like I say, mitochondrial DNA basically never changes. It only changes in the rare case of a mutation, and major mutations only happen every few thousand years. So this means that if person A has a certain mutation and person B has the exact same mutation, we can know that they share the same matrilineal line. These lines are called haplogroups and are labeled with alphabetic codes. My haplogroup is called U. And Family Tree DNA provides me with a map that shows where my line broke off from the main branch. Finally, there is Y DNA. Y DNA is kind of the opposite of mitochondrial DNA in that it only gives you information about your father and your father's father and so on. And I should point out, this test is only available to males. You might remember from biology class that, generally speaking, females have XX chromosomes and males have XY chromosomes. This is because it's the presence of a Y chromosome that determines that someone is male. That Y chromosome only ever comes from one's father, and hence, like mitochondrial DNA, it never changes, except for mutations. So Family Tree DNA gives me a haplogroup map for my Y DNA as well. In my case, I belong to group RM343, also known as R1b, which happens to be by far the most common haplogroup in Europe, representing well over 50% of all men. So nothing too special there. Now I should point out that if you're a female and want to learn about your patrilineal line, you're going to have to get a brother, father, or paternal uncle to do the test for you because only males have Y DNA. Okay, so remember that $80 I mentioned earlier? That gives you autosomal results only. If you want a mitochondrial test, it's $160 extra. And if you want Y DNA, it's $120 extra. So $360 for all three, and that winds up being a lot more expensive than the remaining three companies we're going to look at. But again, you get what you pay for. What sets Family Tree DNA apart is that it gives you way more information on the various mutations in your mitochondrial and Y DNA. And to be honest, this is where it gets way over my head, which leads me to the point I want to make about this test. This is a test that I would recommend primarily for those at the expert level of genetic genealogy. Okay, the third test that I took was the one from 23andMe. 23andMe is unique in that it offers both genealogy and health reports. If you want just the genealogy stuff, it's $100, but if you want both, it's $200. and be prepared to spit into a tube. On the genealogy side, it's pretty similar to family tree DNA. They offer an ethnicity estimate as well as a list of relative matches. However, one thing to note about 23andMe is that they do give you your haplogroup results at no extra charge. I'm not going to go into any more detail about 23andMe because I did an entire video on my results back in 2019. So I'll just leave a link to that in the description. But I will mention a few things about their health results, as I didn't talk about that back then. Basically, they don't offer anything as comprehensive as what Circle DNA offers, but they do check for several dozen genetic diseases and give you a bunch of other fun information, such as what kind of earwax you have and whether or not mosquitoes love biting you. The other neat thing is that they are always updating their research, and you tend to get new reports as time goes on. Moving along, next up is Ancestry.com. Their basic test also goes for $100 and uses the spit method. As the name suggests, the Ancestry test is primarily about your ancestry. It does not give any health information. And unlike 23andMe, it doesn't give you haplogroup information either. But of course, it does give you a breakdown of where your ancestors came from. And this is where Ancestry really stands out because their ethnicity report is much more detailed. This is primarily because of all the DNA companies, they have the largest database of users, particularly when it comes to North Americans. So you can see here that for me, they not only break down European ethnicities into finer categories, they are also able to predict which North American settler communities my ancestors belong to. And from what I know of my family tree, they seem to have things spot on. I know that most of my ancestors came from Germany, England, and Ireland, and settled in Nova Scotia. And this is indeed what the results show. So because Ancestry is basing their results on such a large database of people who, like me, live in North America, I would lean towards saying that these particular ethnicity results are probably the most accurate, for me anyway, of the 5 tests that I've taken. When it comes to relative matches, once again, Ancestry really stands out because of their very large database. So if your main goal is to find relatives and you're from North America, then Ancestry is probably the best place to start. However, I should point out that if you do any of these tests, you should be prepared for the possibility of uncovering surprises. There are numerous stories about people discovering that their father wasn't really their father, or that they had a half-sibling that they didn't know about. You might think that this would never happen to you, but that's what other people thought too. I actually ended up discovering a first cousin that I never knew existed. Turns out she was really nice and had a similar health problem to me, so meeting her online was actually quite cool. Finally, the other great thing about Ancestry is that their website is specifically designed for helping you build your family tree. It has an amazing, easy-to-use interface. Plus, it offers you access to millions of online records. Of course, if you want access to all those records, you do have to sign up for a monthly membership, which costs around $25 per month. Okay, the final test that I took was from MyHeritage, which uses the swab method. MyHeritage is a lot like Ancestry. However, at $80, they hold the distinction of being the least expensive test on the market. And if you wait for one of their sales, you can usually take the test for even less. In fact, MyHeritage is offering free shipping to anyone watching this video. Just use the link in the description and enter the code USEFULCHARTS. Here is what my results from MyHeritage look like. Again, it shows that my ancestors mostly came from Germany, England, and Ireland. And like Ancestry, MyHeritage also shows the various settler communities that my ancestors were a part of. You can see that I obviously have a lot of links to Nova Scotia, which is correct. Like Ancestry, MyHeritage also gives me relative matches and the ability to build my family tree using their website. Again, if you want full access to all their online records, you do need to purchase a monthly membership. Now, besides the fact that MyHeritage is a little bit cheaper than Ancestry, there is one more difference between the two that I should point out. Ancestry is primarily geared towards North America, and therefore has the upper hand when it comes to access to North American records. However, if you are from Europe or want more access to European records, I'd say that MyHeritage has the upper hand. It also has the upper hand if you are Jewish, regardless of where you live. So at this point, I want to give you a bit of a conclusion. I can't really say which of the 5 tests I tried is the best for you, because that really depends on your situation and interests. If you're primarily interested in health information and have money to spend, then I'd say that CircleDNA is hands down your best option. However, if it's genealogy that you're most interested in, there's a few more questions to consider. If you're an expert and want really detailed mitochondrial and Y-DNA reports, and once again you have the money to spend on it, then you'll definitely want to go with Family Tree DNA. However, if you're more of an average person and simply want to spend about $100 on a simple test, you'll want to go with either MyHeritage or Ancestry. I'd recommend MyHeritage for anyone who is Jewish or lives outside of North America, and I'd recommend Ancestry for those in the US or Canada. Finally, if you want a bit of both health info and genealogy info, or you want to find out your haplogroups without breaking the bank, I'd say that you can't go wrong with 23andMe. Now, there's actually one more test that I received for free for review purposes, and I'm going to do an entire separate video about that test in a few months' time. That's because it was not a human DNA test. It was a DNA test for cats. I'm actually a big cat person and am the parent of not 1, not 2, but 3 lovely felines. So stay tuned for a video about that. Okay, so that was a look at some of the DNA tests out there. You can find a link to all of these tests, as well as a few discount codes in the description. And if you have taken more than one test, let me know in the comments which one you thought was best and why. Thanks for watching.